What's one truth you wish you'd said out loud when you were younger?
When people ask me why I am so careful with what I say, and when I say it, I usually laugh it off. But the truth is, I learned early on that silence can be far more powerful than a loud defense. And that lesson became painfully clear at our cousin's wedding when my mother, standing with a microphone in her hand, smiled at the crowd and said she was grateful for the child who never let her down. And every single head in that reception hall turned toward my sister as if it had been rehearsed. While I sat there with a polite expression on my face, pretending I wasn't used to this kind of public erasure. It wasn't the first time she had done something like that, and in a way, it almost felt routine, but when it happened that night, it landed differently because of the setting, the audience, and the fact that this was supposed to be a celebration for family, not a stage for her favoritism. My mother has always had this ability to dismiss me without ever saying my name, to highlight my sister as though she were flawless, as though every accomplishment in our family had her fingerprints on it, and then leave me to swallow the bitterness quietly. As though my silence confirmed her narrative. I could see relatives smiling in agreement, nodding toward my sister with admiration, while others shot me those awkward, pitying glances that suggested they noticed, but would never intervene, and I kept my hands folded in my lap, smiling as though it didn't matter, because what none of them knew was that I had been waiting for this exact kind of moment. The truth is, I had spent years being positioned as the family's disappointment, even when the facts said otherwise. I worked through school, balancing part-time jobs, taking on responsibilities no one noticed, and I never complained when my parents poured their savings into my sister's ventures while I was told to be resourceful and make do. Every slight was documented in my mind, not because I was obsessed with revenge, but because I had reached a point where I knew that if the opportunity presented itself, I would be ready. So when my mother decided to use a microphone at a wedding to broadcast her hierarchy of children, I didn't break, I didn't protest, and I didn't run to the bathroom in tears the way I might have a decade ago. Instead, I sipped my drink, let my sister bask in the applause, and quietly rehearsed in my mind what I knew would happen before the night was over. I don't think my sister even understood the weight of what had just happened, because she sat there beaming, reaching for my mother's hand with the kind of confidence that comes from always being the chosen one, the one who gets the public approval, the whispered pride, the endless safety nets. She had grown accustomed to being framed as the success story, the golden child, while I was framed as the one who did okay, the one who survived, the one who managed. It was insulting, yes, but it was also fuel. Every time I was diminished, I learned to keep my face steady and my tongue still, because eventually silence can be weaponized if you know how to hold it long enough. Throughout the reception, I noticed the way people treated me differently after the toast, as though my mother's statement had been a verdict on who mattered and who didn't. Aunts and uncles congratulated my sister, told her how proud they were of her, while I was given that obligatory nod, the kind you'd offer someone who was clearly outshined. I played along, smiling and saying all the polite things you're supposed to say in those situations, but inside I was steady. Because while everyone else thought the story had ended with that toast, I knew we were only at the beginning. By the time dessert plates were being cleared and people started to loosen their ties and kick off their shoes, I could see my mother relaxed, pleased with herself for once again broadcasting her narrative without challenge. That's when I reached into my bag, touched the folded letter I had carried with me for months, and reminded myself that timing is everything. I didn't pull it out yet. Not while the music was playing and people were still mingling, but just the weight of it against my palm was enough to remind me that tonight, finally, the story was going to change. And for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid of the fallout, because the truth had been sitting with me too long to stay hidden any longer. I sat there smiling, eating dessert, nodding along to conversations, and all the while, I was steadying myself for the moment when the silence would finally break on my terms. I used to think memory was a burden, that carrying around every slight and every rewrite of history would weigh me down until I either broke or became the bitter version of myself my mother liked to imply I already was. Yet the longer I lived inside that family arrangement where my sister Lauren was praised for effort she did not make and I was scolded for boundaries I had every right to set, the more I realized that memory could work like a ledger. Not the kind you wave around in a fight, but the kind you maintain quietly until the moment comes when the numbers are no longer abstract and the debts are due, which is why I started saving things that most people would delete without a thought. Like the text where my mother Diane told me she was so proud of Lauren for covering Grandma's home aid when the truth was that the invoice had my card on it, and the email where she forwarded Lauren the thanks for repairing the roof while asking me, in the same breath, if I could find a way to handle the second half because they were short again, and the photo from the day of Grandpa's funeral when Lauren arrived late and I stood next to my father to keep him steady even as my mother whispered to an aunt that I was being dramatic because I cried. Which is such a strange thing to say when you are burying your parent, but it fit her story, and the story always had one winner and one problem child no matter what the facts tried to do. When I finally had my own life arranged in a way that felt stable, not glamorous, not something that would impress the relatives who collect other people's milestones the way kids collect trading cards, but solid enough that I could handle my own bills and still slip money to the people I loved when they needed it, I promised myself that I would stop trying to convince my mother with speeches or emotional appeals, because she did not respond to feelings unless they validated the hierarchy she enjoyed, and even then the empathy ran one way, toward Lauren, while anything directed at me turned into a cautionary tale about pride or attitude, so I built systems instead, little habits that looked like self-preservation but were also chess moves, like asking contractors to copy me on anything tied to the house even when my mother wanted to keep things between her and her favorite, like sending a confirmation after every transfer with a short line about what it covered so that later there would not be the usual confusion, and like making sure the people my mother bragged to were also the people who occasionally saw me show up first, leave last, and pay the difference when someone else came up short. I do not pretend that I did any of this with saintly motives, because there was always a part of me that imagined the day when I would stop absorbing the humiliation and start redirecting it back to its source, not out of cruelty, but out of the simple conviction that if you keep letting someone rewrite you, you eventually disappear from your own life, and I wanted to be present when the story finally corrected itself, which meant that on the afternoon of that wedding, while the florist adjusted centerpieces and the venue staff taped down cords and the DJ tested the speakers, I took a stroll past the place cards and felt that familiar pull between staying small to keep the peace or making a precise move to shift the room in my favor. And I chose the latter, not by causing a scene or sabotaging anything that belonged to the couple, because that is not who I am and I was not there to hurt them, but by exchanging two cards in a way that would look like an innocent rearrangement. And would place my mother between Aunt Valerie, who knows who actually handled Grandma's final months, because she drove me to appointments when my car was in the shop, and Cousin Mark, who adores Lauren but also manages the nonprofit that received an anonymous donation when their budget cratered last winter and has been trying to figure out who stepped in without asking for recognition. It was not a grand act, and it would not have registered to anyone who was not paying attention, yet I knew my mother well enough to predict that after her toast and the round of attention that followed, she would settle into conversation with the nearest adults who validated her narrative, and that if the nearest adults happened to be the one person who gently refuses to let her fabricate and the one person who cannot resist connecting names to good deeds, then the tone at that end of the table would shift, not toward an argument, because no one in my family has the courage for a real argument when witnesses are present, but toward an accumulation of pointed questions that ask for specifics and dates and sources, which always makes her blink fast and change the subject, and that slight crack in the control she loves so much feels like a stitch being cut on a dress that never really fit me but has been forced over my head for years. You could call that petty, and I would not fight you, although I would add that sometimes pettiness is just precision scaled to the size of the room you are in, and that evening I did not need a confession or a meltdown to feel the balance tip. I only needed the conversation to drift into territory she avoids, which is exactly what happened when Aunt Valerie said, with that soft voice that often sounds like concern but functions like an audit, that she could not stop thinking about how generous it was to keep Grandma at home with a proper aid, such a gift to the whole family, and Cousin Mark, who had already mentioned his nonprofit, asked whether the anonymous donor would ever consider letting them send a plaque, and my mother certain as always that Lauren was the correct answer to every test, nodded and said something about how the family rallies, which is not an answer at all, and yet it left just enough space for Valerie to say that she happened to remember the payments coming from my account, though perhaps she was mistaken, and Mark to say he had wondered if the donor might be closer than the board assumed. And I watched my mother's eyes harden into that familiar shape that warns everyone at the table to stop pressing, because she is about to declare the entire topic unseemly. I did not press, I did not gloat, and I did not rescue her from the corner she had started painting for herself, because my move had already been made, and my job was to let the room do what rooms do when truth is given air, and while they talked around the edges, I pulled out my phone, opened the draft I had prepared the week before titled for later tonight, and adjusted the send time by a half hour so that it would land just after dessert when the clinking of utensils would cover the first waves of buzzing phones, and as I hit schedule knowing that the recipients included exactly the people my mother uses to validate her storytelling, and that the message held polite thank yous with attachments that were not accusations, but confirmations. I felt that calm you only feel when you know the work has been done, and the results are already in motion, which is why when the band launched into another upbeat song, and my mother rose to dance with her favorite, I simply smiled and let the minutes move me toward the moment I had been building for, because the ledger was balanced on my side now, and the next calculation would not be mine to make. Dessert had just started to arrive, and the table was finally settling into that soft lull where people stop performing and let themselves be ordinary again, which is exactly when I reached into my bag, felt the crease of the envelope that had ridden there for weeks like a quiet passenger, and slid it across the linen to my mother with a smile that said nothing and everything at once. Because I had promised myself that when the moment came I would not raise my voice or make a scene or give her the satisfaction of calling me dramatic. I would simply hand her the thing I had written in calm daylight when no one was watching and let the daylight do the talking. She looked at it with the reflex you develop when you expect adoration on command, that quick expectation that it would be a thank you card for the toast or some sentimental note about family, and for a second I almost wished it were that simple. But then she opened it and her eyes caught the first lines where I kept my tone steady and my language clean, and I wrote that I appreciated her words and that I wanted to give her something she might need the next time she spoke about who carried what in our family, and then, line by line, I laid out the kind of facts that do not argue, the confirmations and acknowledgments and documented transfers, each one framed not as an accusation but as a record kept so no one had to rely on memory that bends toward the favored child. And as she moved down the page, I watched the small changes in her face that only a daughter would notice, the tightness at the mouth, the blink that lingers a little too long, the hand that goes still on the dessert fork. Lauren leaned in with the entitlement of a person who believes that every document within reach is hers to interpret, and my mother, who has never been careful when I am the collateral, tried to cover the page with her fingers while murmuring that it was nothing and that we should talk later, yet the page itself contradicted her because it spoke in those plain sentences I had learned to write at work when clarity matters more than flourish. Sentences that thanked specific people for help and attached copies where appropriate and referenced conversations that had taken place in kitchens and hospital rooms and living rooms with their televisions humming, and even if she wanted to call me ungrateful or unstable in the way she likes to do when cornered, there was nothing to attack because the letter did not ask for pity and it did not beg for recognition. It only returned credit to its rightful address and asked her to be as careful with truth as she was with praise. At the far end of the table, Aunt Valerie was telling a story about Grandma's last spring, and Cousin Mark was laughing at something his wife had said. And I could see that this was the part of the evening my mother enjoys most, because it lets her settle into the comfort of her version of us. So when the buzz of the first phone vibrated softly against a saucer, it seemed like the room shrugged. Just a casual interruption, and then another phone lit up, and another, and a few relatives glanced down and frowned in that way people do when they suddenly realize they have missed a piece of context, and while I ate a bite of cake I could see my name appearing on screens around the table, not with drama or alarm, but with that short subject line I had chosen on purpose, a simple thank you followed by the phrase for transparency, and inside those messages were the same confirmations and notes that sat on the page in my mother's hand, all framed politely, all addressed with warmth, all dated, and attributed so that anyone who had ever wondered quietly could connect the tracks without me pointing a finger. My mother's instinct was to regain control, and she tried to laugh as if I had sent family news or photos, yet the chuckles died before they formed because Valerie, who hates conflict but hates dishonesty more, cleared her throat and asked whether the copies matched what Diane had understood to be true, and Mark, who loves Lauren and always will, asked whether there had been a mix-up about the donation he had been wanting to acknowledge publicly. And at that exact moment my mother lifted her eyes to mine, and I held her gaze with the kind of steady patience you learn when your worth has been debated like a budget item, and I said, in a voice that carried just far enough, that I brought the letter so no one had to keep guessing, and that I hoped it would save her from any future embarrassment when she spoke about burdens and loyalty and who showed up when it counted. I did not read the letter aloud, and I did not summarize it for the table, because the point was never to humiliate her in front of strangers. The point was to correct a record she had built at my expense, and let the people she trusts most see that I had not imagined the imbalance. I had simply learned to live under it. And as the band eased into another upbeat song, and the newlyweds swayed nearby with that joy that is not mine to touch, I watched my mother fold the letter with hands that no longer knew where to place authority, and I could feel the atmosphere around us change in that small but permanent way it changes when the easy story stops working, and even though no one shouted and no glass broke and there was no dramatic exit, I knew the first real move had landed, because the color left her face the way certainty leaves a person who realizes the room is seeing them without the script, and I let the silence sit with us while the phones continued to glow, because this was the revenge I had promised myself, clean, undeniable, and time to the minute. The moment after the letter did not explode so much as it sagged under its own weight, because my mother tried to pull the page back into the tidy story she prefers by whispering to Lauren that I was being sensitive and that this was not the time. Yet the words slid off the paper and onto the faces around us where they stayed, and as the phones on the table kept lighting with my scheduled notes that thanked people for help they actually gave and confirmed payments no one had believed came from me, I felt the room begin to correct itself in that slow, almost imperceptible way a picture straightens when you nudge the frame with one finger. And while my mother attempted her usual rescue technique of laughing and asking about honeymoon plans in a voice meant to reset the tone, I watched Aunt Valerie fold her hands and ask if perhaps we should acknowledge what had been clarified, not to scold anyone, but to keep future stories from drifting away from the truth again, and I understood then that the years I had spent documenting the quiet work no one credited me for were finally paying dividends in the only currency that mattered here, which was credibility. The band was about to start another set, and the MC was scanning the room for anyone who wanted to offer a quick toast before the dance floor filled up. And I could feel the old version of me tugging on my sleeve telling me to let it pass and to avoid giving my mother a fresh chance to paint me as dramatic, but the new version of me, the one that had learned to line up facts like dominoes and then flick the first one with a steady finger, stood before I could overthink it, and when the MC offered the microphone, I did not clear my throat or crack a joke or apologize for taking a minute. I simply said, in a voice that carried without shouting, that I wanted to toast the couple for the kind of love that keeps people honest. Because honesty is what makes gratitude land in the right place, and I thanked them for letting us share a day that has reminded me how good it feels when credit and care are aligned, and then, because I had planned this part before I ever set foot in the venue, I told the room that my gift to the newlyweds was simple and not meant to steal a single ounce of attention from them, and that the bar would be fully open for the rest of the night in their honor, and that the band would be staying an extra hour because joy should not be cut short when it is earned. There was a ripple of surprise and then a real cheer, the kind that rises without prompting, and the MC repeated the announcement with that big showman grin while the staff at the bar lifted their hands to signal they were ready. And none of that was about humiliating my mother or outshining my sister. It was about shifting the gravitational center of the night away from the myth that I am stingy with love or stingy with effort or stingy with anything but my tolerance for lies. and as people. Clapped, I saw Cousin Mark look over at me with a dawning recognition that had nothing to do with free drinks and everything to do with connecting this gesture to the quiet donations he had spent months trying to attribute. And I also saw my mother fail to find a smile fast enough, because generosity for me does not fit the story she has told for so long, and when the story stops fitting, the seams show. Before handing back the microphone, I added that I hoped our family would leave tonight with the same promise I was making to myself, which was that when we tell stories, we will use the right names and the right receipts, not because anyone owes me a parade, but because misplacing credit warps relationships until no one recognizes themselves anymore. And I said it warmly and without accusation, and then I turned the toast back to the couple with a wish for long health and easy laughter and the kind of home where people are welcomed as they are without having to earn their spot over and over. And the MC swept me into a quick hug, and the band struck a bright chord that sent half the room to the dance floor. And for a whole minute it looked like we might simply move on with the celebration while my mother found a way to pretend she had always known and approved of my quiet help. But control does not like to be challenged in public, and she reached for my elbow with that grip she uses when she wants to pull me into a corner and rewrite the last 5 minutes before anyone can set the ink, and she told me, through a smile that was not reaching her eyes, that this was not fair and that I had blindsided her and that it was cruel to make her look small on a day that belonged to someone else, and I answered that I had made sure nothing about the day was disturbed, that no one had been shamed, and that the only thing I had done was to put credit back where it belonged and remove her from the burden of inventing from memory the next time she felt compelled to praise one child by erasing the other. And I said I had done it gently because I still loved her even if I no longer accepted the terms she preferred, and that the letter was not a weapon but a record, and that if she wanted to survive this shift with dignity, she could simply let people sit with the truth and adjust at their own pace. Lauren hovered, agitated in that frantic way the favored become when the applause tilts in a direction they did not predict, and she tried to accuse me of buying loyalty with an open bar. Which made me want to laugh, because anyone who has actually worked to keep a family afloat knows that generosity does not buy anything except breathing room. And I told her softly that tonight was not about her image or mine, and that she might feel better if she asked herself why facts feel like attacks only when they do not match the version she has been fed, and I watched her flush and turn away to consult my mother with a look that asked for a counterpunch neither of them could land, and it was then that I reached into my bag again and removed the second envelope, smaller than the first and sealed with a strip of tape, and I pressed it into my mother's hand with the request that she open it at home and read it slowly, because it held exactly one page and exactly one decision, and while she stared at it as if it might burn through her palm, I smiled in a way she would recognize as final, because the first envelope had corrected the past and the second one would decide the future, and as the saxophone climbed and the room spun happily without us, I stepped back and let her hold that choice for the rest of the night, knowing that when she finally broke the seal the ground beneath our story would either settle or crack. When the band finally packed up and the last of the glassware disappeared into plastic bins, I let the night dissolve around me without chasing anyone down for apologies or explanations, because I had already done the only thing that mattered, which was to place the truth where it could live without my constant supervision, and I went home to a quiet apartment that did not ask me to defend myself, where my phone lit up with a string of messages ranging from cousin jokes about the open bar to Valerie's careful check-in to a short line from Mark that simply said he understood more now than he had before, while I pictured my mother sitting at her kitchen table with the smaller envelope between her fingers like it might rattle if she shook it. And I felt no guilt about what came next, because I had not broken anything that wasn't already cracked. I had only refused to hold the pieces together for her one more time. She waited until morning to call, possibly because she hoped I would sleep badly and soften, possibly because she wanted to find the tone that has always worked on me, the one that slices blame into polite ribbons and packages it as concern. Yet when I answered and she said she did not understand why I would escalate things after a family celebration that had gone beautifully, I reminded her gently that I had not escalated anything and that the second envelope was not a threat. It was a fork in the road, and that I would honor whichever way she chose to walk without chasing her to the shoulder like a traffic cop begging for compliance. And when she said she had not opened it yet, I told her I would stay on the line while she did so that there would be no confusion about what it did or did not say. The page was short because I have learned that short can be exact without being cruel, and the first paragraph thanked her for reading and made one request that was not negotiable, which was that within the weekend she would send a clear message to the same relatives who had received my notes, stating plainly that in recent years she had credited the wrong child for specific support, that she had allowed a flattering narrative about Lauren to run unchecked even when it erased mine, and that, going forward, she would name contributions accurately without leveraging public praise as a tool to keep the family ladder exactly where she liked it, and the second paragraph laid out the promise I had already kept for months in the background, which was the creation of a small fund in our grandmother's name housed at Mark's nonprofit to cover home aid gaps for families who fall between the cracks, a fund seated by me with the receipts attached and the paperwork complete, where my mother could choose to be listed as honorary chair if and only if she co-signed a short acknowledgement that matched the facts. Or she could decline and remain a relative whose love I wished well while I kept my distance and stopped serving as the quiet emergency account she cashed without admitting it. There was a third piece that mattered more to me than any title on a brochure, and it said that if she chose not to correct the record or tried to scale it down to the usual private wink and public silence, then I would not argue or protest. I would simply pause all transfers tied to the house and end the late-night rescues she never counts when she tells the story of her strong daughters. I would send vendors to her directly with their invoices instead of triaging them at my kitchen table, and I would move communication about any elder matters back through Valerie, who is kinder than I am and better at keeping notes without apologizing for keeping them. And in that version of our future there would still be birthdays and holiday photos and a polite hello, but there would be no more speeches built on my back and no more phone calls that start with praise for Lauren and slide into requests for me. My mother tried every angle she knows, from blaming my tone to accusing me of shaming her to asking why I was so obsessed with credit when family should be above such bookkeeping, and I told her the same thing I have told myself for years. That credit is not a trophy you wave, it is the shape of accountability you live inside, and that I was finished living inside a shape that did not fit, and when she said she would need time to think, I told her she could take all the time she wanted because time no longer belonged to her, and we ended the call with a long silence that did not hurt me the way it once did because silence finally belonged to me too. By Sunday evening a message appeared in the family thread with my mother's name on it, not poetic and not tearful, just accurate in a way that made my shoulders drop. And while she could not resist one soft detour about how every family has its stories and how we all do our best, she posted the correction and she did not hedge it. And a minute later Mark replied with the announcement of the fund and the way it would honor Grandma's last months, and Valerie added that she was proud of how we were moving forward, and Lauren sent a private note that was half anger and half confusion, asking how I could blindside them with legalese and donations like a corporate play. And I told her there was nothing corporate about refusing to disappear and that she might want to try living as herself instead of as the mirror my mother polishes. What I felt then was not triumph that demanded a parade. It was the kind of steady relief you get when your name finally stops being a rumor and becomes a matter of record. And I did not need her to fall at my feet or rip up old photos or manufacture a new family myth where I become the saint. I only needed the story to change hands, and it did, and when my mother asked if we could try counseling before the holidays, I said yes on one condition, which was that the next time she felt compelled to praise a child into the microphone she would say my name or say nothing at all, and she agreed in that clipped way people agree when they understand the terms are not suggestions, and I hung up, sat at my kitchen table, and let the quiet sit like a guest I had finally invited for myself, because I had not ruined our family, and I had not burned the house down. I had simply moved my furniture out of the room where I was expected to stand behind a curtain and feed lines to the lead, and if anyone wants to call that revenge they can, but to me it felt like the first day of a job I created, where the work is saying what happened and demanding that it counts. and where I did not need a microphone to be heard because I had finally learned how to raise the terms instead of my voice.